Max Gorlin, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Nat Fyfe from the Fremantle Footy Club.
Trent Cotchin from the Richmond Footy Club.
Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Patrick Cooch from the Carlton Footy Club.
It's Rory Sloane here from the Adelaide Crows.
This is Tom Mitchell. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Hey friends, it's MJ from the Coaches Panel. I hope you're well and welcome back to another strategy roundtable where for AFL Fantasy, we look at all the big decisions and dilemmas that you might be facing heading into this upcoming round of fantasy football and help you make informed decisions along the way. Well, because it's getting really to an interesting part of your fantasy footy season, that is for sure. Joining me on this podcast, he's been the buy-round specialist of the Coaches Panel that just keeps hanging around like that mid-price you can't trade out of your team. It's Jordox. Hello, mate. How are you?
Good, mate. You could have just said like a bad smell. That's all right. I know how it works.
The Tom Powell of fantasy football, my friend.
And you keep calling me the buy specialist. I wish I could say that was the case with my team, but yeah, not quite. But good to be back, mate. Really interesting week. You know, the first week post buy, I think a lot of teams maybe that were a little bit underplanned, underprepared may have been found out, albeit with some hard to predict changes in scoring, like a Goulden as a captain would have hurt some huge ceiling scores that if you weren't a part of it, like a Whitfield, bit of a stinker for some, but there's plenty of time to go. And as you know, we'll talk about in this episode, it's time to start, maybe shifting strategy depending on where you've landed.
Yeah, it definitely is. A part of the AFL fantasy community, certainly on the social media forum of X. He's been a dominant part of that. He's been on the podcast before, and definitely if you play AFL Fantasy W, you know and love the work of Liam. Mate, good to have you back on the podcast, and thank goodness the buys are over and we're into the downhill run to the interesting part of your AFL fantasy season. It's a fascinating next couple of weeks, isn't it?
Oh, it's some of the most interesting kind of footballs tactically is happening at this point in the season. There are more teams alive for finals than we basically have had in a very, very long time. And we're seeing some fascinating tactical shifts to try and account for what appears to be a slightly new game style for the first half of the year. And so this is when I enjoy watching football the most, and I enjoy trying to see the cut and thrust. Now, the same can't be said for my fantasy team personally, but I think it's really fascinating that normally this is the round where a lot of the really, really highly ranked coaches launch themselves up. They've lined up everything in a row perfectly coming out of the buys. But Hayden Young and Errol Goulden, a few other stinky premiums that we had through the buys throwing up sub-80 scores probably tanked that in a way that a lot of people weren't expecting. So these next couple of weeks are going to be even more fascinating because now what we thought were locked-in premiums, your Jack Crisps, we were expecting that. We've now got to try and recover and test whether or not we think from a football sense they're going to hang around in the roles that really got us or got you to a high rank in the first place.
There are some teams that this is the week they'll finally get to what they would say is a quote-unquote completed team where they've really got all their cash cows off the ground politely. And then there are others, like you mentioned, they're looking at the Crisp going, look, he's been great for a while, but now I'm in luxury trade and I start to do fixtures and start to do a bunch of different things. So really a fascinating space for those chasing the ranking, but also those in leagues. And maybe we want to start in that space because I do want to talk about some of the tactics and changes. I want to talk 23rd premiums and options that you boys have got for us in a minute. But there is this junction now in the season for coaches, and maybe you've kind of held off and hoped, okay, maybe my ranking will get better. Maybe it won't get better, but certainly where you're placed now is a pretty good indicator. You might move a few thousand spots if you're in the middle tiers of the 10s and 20,000s, but for the most part, you're probably fairly ranked now that we're through the buys and had a best 22. So for some coaches, their focus moves off rank, and now it's about beating workmates, friends, cash leagues, whatever it is, while others, there's a few hundred, maybe a couple of thousand that have eyes on hats and the grand prize overall. So maybe, Liam, we'll start with you, and Jordox, definitely want to get your take on this as well. But What's the different mindset change now that based on our ranking or league, we've got a pretty good indicator of where we are? What's a differentiation of mindset and focus we need to have? Because I don't think that a rankings focus fits a league mindset and vice versa. How does it, Liam, work together for us so that we identify correctly where we should be and ultimately the way we should be trading and making our moves?
Yeah, I think it's really an interesting inversion or a replacement, because quite often when you're doing upgrade cadence, just when we're all playing for Classic, you just say, look, I just need to get in premiums. The run that they might have or a slightly tougher matchup may not be as important, because averaged out over the next 10, 15, 20 weeks in my side, if I see them truly as a premium, the fact that I've got them and it's not perfect value matters less than the fact that I've actually got them and they can pop a really high run. When you get to going for leagues, that actually becomes the more predominant theory, which is just get the good player in, even if it's a tougher matchup this week, particularly if you're in a stage where you know that you've got a ranking locked in, you've got an easier matchup this week, you don't have to worry about it as much. You're trying to beat a specific team on a specific round and you know you're going to want those premiums. It's more actually about their run at a time further down the track than perhaps you've probably been doing up to now. It's more just, I just need to get these players in. And the same applies for players that might have a tag, players that might ultimately, have a soft 1 week injury. Less important about trading those players out now if you know you've sewn up a final spot, or if you feel like you've got a comfortable win. More important to still have those players around when the finals actually come around. So it's a really like, you're taking your strategies from the first 10 weeks of Classic and just replacing them and playing them for the next 4 weeks in your leagues.
Jordox, you got some thoughts on not just the mindset, but the approach that we should be having, and that beautiful terminology of cadence that Liam's introduced for us into this episode. What is some of that cadence maneuvering and mindset that does change for how we approach the game?
Yeah, look, I think Liam's absolutely nailed it. Like, the differences between the two are exactly that. You don't worry about the price as much, the tags, it's more about the end game when you're playing for league. Whereas overall, it's, week to week, minute by minute. I actually find it really hard to play a season and have a bit of both. So I play AF for overall. 100%. I don't have any leagues that I'm paying attention to. And then I play Dream Team, the old school one, for leagues and draft comps and whatnot. So very competitive in those. But even in Dream Team, I know we're talking about AF, but playing a format, I'm really high up in the ranks, but I just want to win my league. So some weeks I'm tempted to trade and play because I'm really near the top in the overall. But at the end of the day, I value the premiership more than anything, and I have to be disciplined. So that's the difference between, jumping on guys at the right price at the right time. It's like, well, I don't need to make those trades. I don't need to move those players on right now. But it's very different when it's for overall. So yeah, look, in terms of changing your strategy now, I mean, you might be someone who does have eggs in each basket, and yeah, maybe we've turned around after the buys and your ranking's pretty average. You could maybe just move all your strategy to one, or it could be vice versa. You could be having a really good overall and for some reason not in your league. But I do think it's hard to balance the two of them for a lot of the reasons Liam laid out.
Yeah, one becomes the lead, one becomes the lag. It doesn't mean you can't do both. It's just one becomes the primary driver behind it. I'm curious, Liam, you talked a little bit about, and Jordox echoed the sentiment too, around this idea of keeping this mindset and eyes on what your opponents are doing in your leagues, either week to week based on a head-to-head matchup and or certain victories that you've got to get into a league position that you want to be, whether that be top 2, qualify for finals or things of that nature. If you're going for a rankings focus, just to kind of pivot the conversation there, do you use tools such as the identification of players that are owned in the top 100 and top 1,000, if you are going for ranks? Do you use a similar ideology to borrow that across and go, okay, an Elliot Yeo type, for example, might be only owned in one or two teams in the top 100. Does he become a more appetizing differentiator as opposed to a potential other Will Powell, for example? So how do you use the ownership percentage in the qualifying top end? And is it similar to the way you'd approach a league mindset?
They are fascinating. I actually think the league mindset is far closer to what you see like the super high, like top 5 ranks talking about when you get to the final part of the season. And it's going, okay, I need to be matching these certain players because I know that I don't have them, but we have these points of difference. Therefore, with this match cup coming up, I need to make sure I'm covering for this game. Whereas, the kind of top 100, top 1,000 thing, that's a fascinating thing to be doing when you are just going for ranking. But I think that it should only start to become a consideration around about this time of the year, when you are maybe trying to take an aggressive step or you feel like someone's being undervalued. But I don't think using it as a primary driver at any other point or making it your primary driver at any point in the season is a good way to go about playing fantasy, because I think you're looking at the wrong factors if you think that, the amount that coaches own a person is determinative of their value or should be the highest ranking, reason to bring someone in. But it is, it's a fascinating little like buy play. It's really like when you get to this league matchup time of the year, you're actually taking on some of the most important strategies from Classic. It's just that you're marrying up end of season extreme strategy on players with early season trade cadence for Classic, which I think is like I've only had to do it a couple of times in the last few years, but it's a fascinating way of like realizing that you're not actually doing anything that new. You're just melding them together at different times.
Yeah, it's true. So we are at this point of year and with our trade cadence that some coaches are finally getting that dreaded cash cow off field, whether it be a Schoenmaker, a Dowling, a Reveal, who was perfectly fine for us to have on field this week if it was in the forward line, given the lack of consistent 90-plus scoring we get through there. So some coaches are in that position, again, fingers crossed with injuries and things like that, while other coaches are well and truly now into the luxury cadence. And maybe they were there as early as last week for coaches that are highly ranked and got a high team value. And Jordox, it brings us back to that conversation that we had last week, where should and how should we be investing the dollars in our team? Should we continue to pile as much money into on-field as we can and start rotating these players through that either have had poor week or two and we just want to jump off them? Or are we trying to still build a little bit of bench hygiene, but at a higher level? Because sometimes it can trip us up. A great illustration of that is Clayton Oliver. On paper, it made an enormous amount of sense to move off him. It made so much sense. And yet those that traded out of him, unless they got into a player like a Noah Anderson, a Lockie Whitfield, or a Josh Dunkley, where they get the top sort of score of the round, they do lament, I made that trade and really didn't make any points with that sort of trade. And so we'll get to some players specifically in a moment, but has your mindset changed or evolved in the past week or so around the mindset of, is it worth getting a 23rd premium and building depth? Or is it still an idea of, players on field, stuff your bench to a degree, and it's just about maximizing scoring on field? Where do you kind of find yourself sitting at the moment on that, Jordox?
Yeah, it depends on so many different variables, as we know and love in this game. So I guess, for example, before I'd be adding a 23rd premium as a backup, I'd be evaluating the 22 I've got and saying, not every single one has to be top 6, top 8, or even top 10 in their line, but you want them to be close enough. You want their form to be pretty good too. So before upgrading, another kid to an underpriced 23rd premium that you can use as a loop from week to week, I'd be looking at the field and saying, well, who's on there at the moment that's either out of form, someone I'm not expected to be, top 10, say, in their line from here to the end. Not what they've done to this point, but from here till the end. So guys like Sexton, who has been great, but we're all sensing possibly a role change, even though that didn't really eventuate the second week with Power. Someone like a Nick Martin, he's been great all year, starting to just trickle forward a bit, hasn't impacted his scoring until last week. And then the other bit is the position. So, we know the scarcity of high-quality primo forwards this year. We've been talking about it all year, and we haven't had the DPPs come in to save us in previous years. It really is what it is at this stage. So trading out, the measure and the worth of your F6 versus your M8. And then as a direct knock-on, if you had an F7 you were playing with versus an M9, it is quite different. So I think if your 22 are pretty much set, you can, start looking at your backup guys. And, it's not even necessarily a case of trading in a backup guy. I know we're going to talk about some 23rd options later, but it's more about getting in the most informed, affordable, brilliant primo of that line and shifting maybe one of your underperformers to the bench to be a backup. The other thing you've got to look at with any of these things is the fixture. It's no good if your loop guy is just a Sunday guy, and I don't know the fixture, but I assume sides like West Coast, Hawthorn probably get lots of Sunday games based on previous years, not this year, versus, your Collingwoods and your Essendons and those sorts of guys that you can loop on a Friday night or a Saturday night. And then if you've got that Harry Barnett type, that's more for vice captains, really. Yeah, scratch that last point. The rest of what I said made sense.
I understand where you're going to. Liam, where's your thought process on this? I know you've thought it through a fair bit. What's your take?
Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating thing, and it's definitely one for fantasy players. Probably haven't been exposed to nearly as much as in Supercoach or in the limited trade formats where there's been a need to cover for, when you run out of trades, you need to have some kind of coverage as a premium. But what I think is really fascinating, and I don't think it's been discussed nearly enough, is that I'm actually not seeing a 23rd premium nearly as much to protect for bad forward scores, because I would actually say that in the last 6 weeks, the forwards have really stabilised. Forward floor scores, if you've avoided Simpkin, for example, I think, and Fisher has an injury, but the real floor scores have kind of started to dissipate. I actually think the more important thing that they can cover is in a week where you've got an injury or forward, and at the same time you have someone is getting a tag. Because I think that's the real thing that we're getting more of this year than we have in previous seasons, is we're seeing upcoming matchups where that team runs an incredibly strong tag or multiple tags or cooling roles against key players. And for a very long time, the best midfielders, we haven't had to worry about that nearly as much. There's been your classic tag targets. Lachie Neale has always been, in the last 3 years, has been probably the most impacted consistently by tags. We haven't seen that same prevalence. That's changing a bit this year. And I think that running a 23rd premium gives you the capacity on any line to have some more flexibility, because if most people are running a Sexton or a Fisher, that gives you forward defender flexibility. We've got a lot of defensive options this year, and a lot of them have midfielder flexibility as well. So I actually think that what's more important is if you're looking at your team right now and you see that you've got a few issues with midfielders, in particular that have tags upcoming, you should actually be looking to bring in a 23rd premium to insulate you from some of the risk of the 50 that Lachie Neale had a few weeks ago because of an extremely strong tag, or because a tag goes in an unexpected direction. If you're going up against North and you're concerned that Will Phillips may suddenly not go to Bont, it's not going to go to Libba, who've been the more traditional tag targets. It's Adam Treloar, and he gets that for 2.5 quarters, like on the weekend. And I think that's where the real value comes from. Now, in terms of, Jordox, what you were discussing, which is, should you be looking to upgrade your kind of worst performing players? I think that then comes down to, well, that player might be underperforming, but to what extent do I trust them to stabilise? So the difference between a good run upcoming and, several really bad games in the wet. or if they've had a subtle role change in a couple of losses. I'm talking specifically about Nick Martin. Nick Martin hasn't scored great. He's played a little bit more forward. They've not played particularly well recently either. And to make matters worse, that was a torrential downpour before the game and during the game against Geelong. Not a great one for someone who often gets a lot of marks.
Yes.
And so I think that holding on to Nick Martin and saying what I'm actually going to do is trying to bring on a 23rd premium, someone in that 700K range, if you're one of the, few coaches that of the, outside of the 20K or whatever it was, who brought in Rosie last week, that's a perfect option for you. He's someone with 120 plus.
This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first. Like, to check you have the tickets in your wallet first before you drive 2 hours to the big game. Seriously, you had one job. Now the closest you'll get to the 50-yard line is parking lot D. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
Scoring ceiling. But trying to pick a player up in that range on top of a rookie can be more impactful for your team down the long run, ensuring for some of those risks. That I'm all for it. If your side can accommodate it, particularly if they're at a higher level, I think you give yourself so much more flexibility and so much more insurance.
Well, you talk about players that sit in that potential risk profile. We all looked at the scoring of a Jack Sinclair last week and we're like, oh, wow, like 120, 130, incredible. But you look at the matchup this week, there's a high probability that either he or a Nazaya Wanganeen-Miller up against, I think they got the Swans this week. There's a high balance of probability that a Jordan, the magnet is just coming to go and lock down on that. Toby Bedford and the Giants, I think they learnt their lesson at halftime. Yeah, Dawson's a damaging player. Go on the more nimble style player that you can impact. So potentially there's a Sam Walsh type of tag that could be coming there through there as well. So I think that's the right ideology. And do you go up for a Sinclair, or do you go, you know what, I'll save myself 200K and I'll get a Powell, for example, who's under 700,000, and on paper you might like that matchup a little bit more. So I think that's a really helpful unpacking and good sides of the coin. What's the risk in investing into a 23rd premium as opposed to the upside of, instead of swimming in the 700 and maybe the low 800 swimming pool and missing some of the top end guys, where's the other side of the risk of that? Because sometimes we can look really rosy-eyed glassed at, oh, we get a Rosie, we get a Powell, we get a Dylan Moore, whatever it is, the player we suggest, the Jordan Sweet in the ruck. Yep, there's my one per podcast. We're done. If I can't get Bruce, I'll get Sweet in. But is it now when we discuss Josh Kelly and the pinged calf, or is that too early? Sorry, I thought that was contractually obligated to have a Josh Kelly reference in. I thought I'd get it in before the hour mark.
He looked good on the weekend too.
He did look good. It's either that or a reference to hair. It's one of the two that we have to get in. And if you get both, it's some kind of fantasy footy coaches battle bingo. But what's the other side of that? Like missing these top end guys that are absolutely flying and cooking at the moment. I know it's not that many people, but there is still a portion of the community without a Sam Flanders at the moment, for example. There are some top end mids that have been crushing it for 4, 5, 6 weeks in a row, let alone in our back line. What's the other side of the coin of missing these guys when you can afford it, Liam, and getting I'll just build depth, but miss the top end? What's the other side of the risk that coaches need to consider?
It's the same risks we were talking about in the preseason by running 3 rucks, going the Cherry, Grundy, Gawn. You have value, and that means you have points locked up on your bench that you can't use. So that's one very simple risk that you end up having. And it's a very real possibility that you might overthink a loop and you end up putting in a score overly risky and you try and loop a premium, and lo and behold, the person that you were worried about, your stuff, they go and hit a 130. And then you've locked up a worse score because you overthought it. I think the other thing as well is obviously you are missing out on the capacity to bring in players who can go 130, 140, 150. And so I do think that as much as I like the idea of a 23rd premium, there is a team structure that suits it right now. It's not mine. I have too many problems in my own team to be thinking about doing it because I would be holding on to bad players in order to do it. But if you're at the stage now where I know that there are probably a number of highly ranked coaches who've been thinking about, I have a completed team effectively at round 14. If you're now just trying to sideways the entire time, you're going to create pitfalls for yourself when in reality you could have created some ladders to make that fall slightly less difficult to pull yourself out of. And so I do think you need to ask yourself, like, if you haven't got a Bontempelli, for example, a bloke that can go on runs of 130, then that's a player to upgrade to versus trying to bring in a Brian Myers at 7-10K as a 23rd premium, for example. But if you feel like you've got a pretty solid group of midfielders and you know that there's going to be some real pop scores throughout it, but you know there's some, for example, if you've got a Dawson and you're like, I feel like there are going to be some tags upcoming, but alternatively, there are some really great matchups upcoming as well. Maybe running that 23rd premium gives you the peace of mind to not waste a trade, or possibly two, to trade him out and then trade him back in again further down the line. And you can really conserve the trade for when issues will crop up, because we've actually largely gone unscathed on premium injuries for most of the year. So heaven forbid I jinx anyone's team out there. Mine's already completely broken. I've got the Tom Green one, so let's not even go there. But it's definitely eminently possible we're going to get one of those at this point.
Yeah.
Don't sign yourself up for two trade in, trade out. A lot of people did that with Ryan this week. I think that was an error.
Yeah, and I was going to say before as well, we are getting to the point of the year now. I mean, every club's had 2 buys now, so theoretically they should all be refreshed. But as they start their march towards finals, we're going to see, I think we're going to have some more painful Thursday nights than we have with selection so far this year. Because like you said, touchwood, by and by, it hasn't been too bad. I can't recall too many nights of Thursday night carnage, as we like to call it. So having that 23rd will protect you against that. And I guess, MJ, you were saying, that what are the downfalls of that strategy? And it is, not getting a, like you said, a Bontempelli and getting Rosie instead. Maybe the value makes it much better, but the points are really what we're chasing. Points are what take you higher in the overall. Doesn't matter about the cash you saved, as nice as it is to save cash. But I think the risk is, and I don't call it getting too cute, because if you've got 22 primos and you bring in a 23rd, I don't think that's getting too cute. But there is a high chance you get burnt and you end up fielding the wrong player. It's like rookie roulette. How painful is that when 1 week you put this guy on because you think the role's good or the matchup's good and he scores 50, and then his mate on the bench drops an 85. It's like, okay, well, next week maybe I'll switch it up. What happens? The scores switch. It's like playing rookie roulette, but you're playing primo roulette. It's not for the faint-hearted, and you've got to be super prepared. You've got to have the right loops in place, know the week, the days of the week each side is playing, be ready for subs, be ready for late ins. We've seen the horror stories where someone's, got an awesome vice captain. They whacked the C on this player that was an emergency. And then I think the rest, late in, disaster. So you've got to be absolutely all over it like a rash if you do choose to play it that way, because you could get caught with the wrong player on field and costing yourself points rather than the aim, which is to protect you from those lower scores.
So if we are going to try to look at a 23rd premium, I know as you've been listening or watching it, if you're watching, hi, nice to have you on board. Comment below if you're into the 23rd premium or not. Thank you. There's the one per pod. Appreciate that one. He's referencing his own, not mine, just so you know. But if we are looking at a 23rder, And I think through the past 10 minutes, people have gone, yeah, this is a play. And then others go, no, this is not. And then maybe kind of bounced back at it. And that's, like you mentioned, Elliot, that's why we're having this conversation, because it needs to sit. We need to process it. And it's an important thing to consider. If coaches are going to go a 23rd premium, who are a couple of the guys we could look at? I've given you some homework, lads. You've got some names for me. Liam, kick us off. Who are 2 or 3 guys we could consider if we want to get to a 23rd premium? Technically, it could be a value pick if you're still struggling to complete your team too due to some cash problems. But if we're going for a 23rd, who are you looking and why?
Okay, so I think that I took this like 23rd premium. I'm going under 800K. I'm assuming that most people are going to be trying to only using, let's say you've got a Joe Richards and a Joel Frazier, for example. You're getting to 800K maximum. I think there are a few players that have had good last 3 runs that I think can put together consistent scores that are well above what your rookie's going to be putting up. I think the first one is flavor of the month, and that's Isaac Rankin. I think running Isaac Rankin even as your S6 and trying to use Alex Sexton, for example, as your 23rd premium, a perfectly rational strategy that I would fully endorse. I think I owned Isaac Rankin after he had that pop score before the Essendon game and sadly had to trade him out due to injury, but I love what he's rounding into. MJ, you'd also mentioned Elliot. I don't actually think that that's the worst option, because I do think that there's some real there's some role security for Elliott. And earlier in the year, we were like, oh, great, he's insulated from risk because we've got best 18 during the early buys. Doesn't matter. We'll start the season with him, even though we know that he's liable to pop an injury. If you're using him as a 23rd premium, you're again not relying on him in this same way that we have done in the past. And then I think another one that I think is like slightly out there, but just because they play so many games on Sunday. So I think this is really helpful. If you've already got a premium and you're worried about a tag, then if they use the tag, then you bring him in. And that's John Newcomb, because I do think that we've seen in the last couple of seasons, he's a better scorer in the back half of the year. They have an okay set of matchups to finish the year, but it's that Sunday fixture that could really help you. If you're looking to get a 90, 95 and really insulate you from some of the really bad 50s and 60s you can get when a Chincotta sits on you or when Marcus Windhager completely destroys your day. So those are like that 700K range. I think I'll defer to Jordox before I go super speculative at 600K, because it starts to get pretty fast and wild. But those are kind of 3 that I think I would personally be looking at if you're really desperate.
Nice. Jordox, who you got for us, mate?
Well, MJ, it's back to my school days because I actually didn't do the homework.
Oh, of course you did.
I'll give you a different approach. So the way I looked at it I thought about what you asked me to do, I just didn't actually do it. But the way I thought about it.
So you're channeling some Rids right now. Okay, I appreciate that.
Yes, Rids would be proud. But the way I looked at it was less about a 23rd player that I'm targeting and more about a case of, if I'm playing that strategy, I'm not actually targeting a 23rd guy. I'm targeting the top dog that I've missed out on, be it a Bont, be it it's a...
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Flanders, if you don't have him. And so I'm actually more looking at my side and thinking, who are the players that any given week when they play, and these are primos, right? They're on my field. I'm nervous. I know that this could be the week that this player cost me big time. LDU is a great example. We know what he's capable of, but we also know that he can have a really good game and just score an 85 in fantasy. So he's probably someone I'd look at upgrading around him, getting in, a Sam Walsh, who I don't have, and pushing him to M7. how many we got? M9 rather, and playing it that way. So when I talk about the names, I'm thinking more of guys that people might still have that rather than getting rid of or upgrading, if you can upgrade around, could actually be quite handy. So I think about a Jack Crisp who, the smart coaches jumped on early, still have him. We're now starting to see, well, I think he had one bad game. We may be overreacting, but I know DeGoey's back last week. Pendlebury was back. They've got some more soldiers coming back. I'm sure Tom Mitchell's not far off. So anyway, they have a lot of Friday night games. I think they've got at least 2 or 3 on the run home that I had a quick look at. He's someone you could whack an E on, and that's your 23rd and play it that way. Similar guys would be Tom Stewart, who's under 700K. And, for anyone who owned him for even 1 week this year, has been very frustrating. What
about those that owned him for 2?
Yes. Yeah, well, I might be getting back probably now. But if he's got this midfield role, okay, he's a great D7. Other guys include, Jack McRae. I mean, he's so poor. He just scores 60s.
Don't do it to yourself. Just don't.
No. Get rid of him. Just get rid of him. But Oliver was the perfect one.
Yeah.
If anyone was in a position to just push him to M9, chuck an E on him, and just see, they would have been laughing last week. So I guess the way I've looked at it is a little different. Instead of targeting 23rd, it's who are the guys that would cut everyone's got one of these guys. They're a pain in the bum. We want to upgrade them, but we just haven't had a chance. Maybe it's a point of the year that hold them because there was something in them. You bought them for a reason. Just put them to the bench. Let them warm the bench for you and see if it works that way.
I'm keen in a minute, Liam, to hear some of this speculative 600 crew that you've got lined up for us, because there's going to be some interesting ones. But you're right, there's some awesome options at that 700 range too. You've mentioned Rosie's still in that range. Oliver's in that range. Perfect guys that at the start of the season, I think we all thought were 110 sort of markers, and a variety of variables has got them cheap. Powell, I've already mentioned in this podcast, he's under 700,000. But if I'm going to 23rd premium, I'm looking for a guy that's got ceiling. I don't just want to drip my way to an 80, 90, or even a low ton. I'm looking for someone who on their day can absolutely rip a 130, 140, 150, 160 out, and players like a Jeremy Cameron sit in that range. If the fixture sits right, he's the style of player. So that's what I'd be looking for if I was looking for a 23rd premium and trading into one, not just pushing depth to the bench. If I was doing it, I'd be using, as Liam's talked about, looking fixtures, looking at matchups, and who's in that ceiling spot, that I could almost take that kind of waiver wire approach of drafts, or your daily fantasy approach of, I'm just going to get this one, and if it pops, man, I'm onto something here. That for me would be how I might approach it. But you mentioned this speculative 600K. You've got me interested. Give me a couple of the names.
Options. I've got a few options. You want ceiling? I've got ceiling, and it's Jaden Short, because Richmond have an excellent run for designated kickers to end the year. They got Fremantle this week. They've still got a Collingwood, a St Kilda, and a Hawthorn matchup to come before the end of the year. He is bargain basement cheap at the minute, sitting at 673. Lockie Ash is another one who has a great run for designated kickers. And if Lockie Whitfield decides to share any kick-ins, he's someone that can still put together 110 on his day. I don't hate... You stole one from me. I think Tom Stewart is the perfect example. If you've got the capacity to bring him in, we know that he can score particularly well. If this midfield role holds, that's great. I also think that if he goes back to defence and teams start to realise that if they go to tag him, he'll just move around. Maybe he can return to his intercepting best. And we know that that's effectively 100 averaging player when he's there. One super speculative one, but again, it's a great run, particularly if you need one for a few weeks, and that's Sam Switkowski, who's well down. I actually haven't even got his price at this stage, but Fremantle have a great run to end the year. He's at 622K. Again, a player that's quite important to that team. He's played some of his best games in their last 3 to 4 matches, and that's when they've looked the best effectively this year. So again, I'm not suggesting, they've got my stamp of approval in any way, shape or form. But if you are desperate and you're looking in areas, and this might even be your F6 if you're looking to generate some cash, they effectively operate at the same thing at this stage and at this cash range. But yeah, I think there's definitely a few options out there. This is very much looking at runs upcoming through to the end of the year. I think what's interesting, MJ, I think at this stage, this is probably one of the earliest times I've heard the AFL fantasy community talking about 23rd premiums. I think this is a different type to the runs right at the back end of the year when we're talking about the Jeremy Camerons. We're looking for the Tex Walkers of last year. We're looking for those players that are searching for a Coleman or are thrust completely into the midfield and have a completely different role. And it's just like, well, if this fails, then there's only 2 weeks left. I think I agree, like the Jeremy Cameron play from 2019, 2020, whenever it was, that's about a month away. I think my call for consistency was more, look, if I'm going to hold this player for 8 weeks, I probably want them as a backstop more than as an exclamation point.
Yep, no, it's a fair shout too. So let's talk, before we wrap up this podcast, you boys have been excellent in this episode, helping so many of our listeners navigate these pitfall moments and dilemma moments that we do need to consider. But Liam, one of the things you've brought to the fore, certainly in the AFL Fantasy W community, where we've really got introduced to your work, and now the AFL Fantasy men's community is starting to understand that ability to bring in statistical analysis and trends, yourself, Jaden, the guys at DFS Australia, and a bunch of others in the community as well. We could spend the next 20 minutes talking who they are and naming them and sharing those details. But you're certainly right at the forefront of people leading and understanding about the tactical components of the game, the things that have changed, and how, in an AFL fantasy sense, those that are the fast adapters and really getting on the front end of that can really get not just at the head of the tidal wave, but really can get at the very onset of it as well. So what are some things you've seen over the past, let's say, just fortnight or so tactically in the game of AFL that is having a level of trending impact that for us in the AFL fantasy community, if we listen, learn, observe, and apply, gosh, we actually might start the tidal wave here?
Yeah, I think we're as I said at the outset of the episode, this is some of the most fascinating football you'll see all year, because it really is at the peak moment where coaches are better able to predict what opponents are going to do, and then they're trying to come out with the counter punches, the counter attacks to try and beat that. So I think the most clear example that we've seen is with Lachie Whitfield. He had that stretch of really bad games where he was tagged aggressively out of the games. We've seen him come out of the bye, and you can see he's clearly got a greater license to tackle and a greater, there is a more of a directive to get the ball in his hands. But that one is almost one which has gone past us now, because he's now put together this great run. He's completely beaten what should have otherwise been a pretty tag-heavy situation. What I'm now at the stage of, and I was thinking about this after watching one of my favorite boys, Dan Houston, absolutely stink up the joint on the weekend. But I wasn't so much like thinking that Dan Houston had played badly. What I was thinking about, well, I've actually missed that Dan Houston has had some great performances against St Kilda in the past, and Port Adelaide have already played St Kilda this season. So you're at the stage now where I would almost be suggesting, yeah, okay, look at who are the most impactful players from a week prior. But if a team has played each other prior, actually go back and read the match report, go back and look at the player ratings, go back and look at the fantasy scores, and also see who got coaches' votes. See who the coaches agree were the most impactful people in that game. And then work forwards from there. Go, all right, Dan Houston was impactful the last game he played, and he's been impactful against St Kilda in the past. Well, what are you going to do then? St Kilda don't have a tagger that they run in their forward line. But since the return of Liam Henry and the fact that Dan Butler is healthy, they now have 3 small forwards who can run around after halfbacks all day. As a result, you go, well, Marcus, you take someone in the midfield. That's fine. We'll run around and do that. But we know that Dan Houston is one of the most damaging kicks in the comp, and he's done it to us before, and he gets coaches' votes. we're now going to try and find a strategy to do it. Thinking the same way about a number of different matchups and saying, well, it might not actually be that the most informed player in the last 3 games is the player that's going to get a role stuck on them. It might actually be the most impactful player when these two sides met in the past. And that's something I really implore coaches to start doing. And then going back and watching or working forward as if you are the coach. You're sitting there, we're Ross Lyon, and we're going, well, how are we going to stop Dan Houston? We're not going to not run a tag because Port Adelaide have 3 midfielders you could conceivably run a tag on, and then test the reasonableness of it. There was some really great analysis last week thinking about, well, maybe Adam Treloar is the one who gets the tag because Libba hasn't been as impactful and Will Phillip isn't that kind of player and Bont's a bit big. And I think that that's the kind of analysis we need to be doing. Adam Treloar has not been tagged at any point this year. But last week was the week that we went, actually, this might not be the perfect time. Same goes for Tom Stewart. Tom Stewart has not played a minute of midfield pretty much this year. Even if he has had a couple of CBAs and I can't remember them, like I'm a jaded owner for the entire season, sue me. Importantly for this performance was the Bombers have run at Matt Guelphy as a tag throughout the year. And the writing was 100% on the wall that Matt Guelphy was going to go to Tom Stewart again. But it also wasn't the first time that Geelong would have going to have seen it, because the first time we saw Guelphy run the tag was in the final preseason game between these two sides this year. And I think, again,
it feels like you can get your credit scores anywhere these days. Random websites, card statements, budgeting apps, heck, even your dog might bark out a few numbers. It's true. Credit Karma isn't the only place you can find them. But we actually do more with your scores to help you find your next financial opportunity. Like a more rewarding credit card, a game plan that helps you pay down debt faster, or a personal loan to help you save more on interest payments each month. Cha-ching! The possibilities are kinda endless. Download Intuit Credit Karma today to get started.
Putting more fantasy coaches, putting your actual football coach hat on and say, well, Geelong aren't playing very well and Tom Stewart gets tagged and they don't win. And they've tried pretty much everything, including sending him forward against Carlton, which was horrendous to watch. I have no idea why that was the case. But at this point, they've thrown everything bar putting him in the midfield. So I think it's very much a case of you need to be, at this time of the year, putting your coach's hat on and saying, well, we know that at the beginning of the year, we were just seeing all this halfback play. And then teams started to amp up the pressure a little bit as we got through the year. And then teams started realizing, well, we can tag halfbacks and midfielders. And that's now been 4 or 5 weeks of that. We're now reaching the next point, which is you need to be watching to see which teams are good at breaking tags, which teams like GWS really facilitate their players getting off a tag, and which ones require very structural things like Geelong be able to break it, and making note of those so that when you are trying to predict roles going forward, when you are trying to see whether or not it will be an impactful game plan change, if that'll actually impact your fantasy side. So yes, that's my absolute diatribe. And sorry if it's completely rambling, but this is the time of year where you've got to be a football coach more than I'd say almost any other time.
Yeah, I think that's not only is that fascinating, but it's almost, again, one of these must-haves. The way the AFL Fantasy and Supercoach and Dream Team, although this podcast is not targeted for them, there is a greater leveling up of understanding in the game. Even this year, the bringing into the fore, Jaden talking about stoppage points versus transition. 3 or 4 years ago, the guys at the draft doctors bringing in an understanding of centre bounce attendance and a level of correlation that can come due to tracking a player's midfield role that can come into that. And now you're talking about that. It's just the next frontier for coaches to be able to lean into and step into. And so on that, Liam, who are some of the clubs or players that we do need to start looking at for these next couple of weeks? Because again, we look at a Will Phillips type, we look at a James Jordan type, we look at a Chincotta type. Again, we're understanding the taggers and the impacts, but you're taking us beyond just that phase of ringing the bell of beware the tagger. You're elevating us to another space. So who are some of the clubs or players that you're forecasting we could be paying a little bit more attention to over these next 2 to 3 weeks?
Well, it's my first example, and this is because I was doing some research into this over the weekend because after I'd had this thought, North playing against Gold Coast, I would not be surprised if LDUCs took attention again. He was their only good player when they played last time. I think he might have got 8 coaches' votes. And that is absolutely the kind of thing that I reckon Damien Hardwick on his day might decide, actually, we might put some more stoppage attention. Oh, it would be a hard tag, but that's the kind of one where LDU hasn't been amazing recently from a football sense or a fantasy sense, but he was really good the last time they played. Another one that's going to be fascinating, I think, for me this week is listening to Coach Brad Scott talk about we're going to make some positional changes. We're going to continue to tinker with our lineups. Writing on the wall for me, I would not be shocked if the Bombers try and run a tag on Nick Dacos in the same way that we haven't seen the Bombers run really a midfield tag at all this year. I think, and the worst thing is I don't necessarily know who it's going to come from. So this is a speculative call, but listening to coaches who talk about the need to stay positionally flexible, I think that when you're going up against such a dominant player like Nick Dacos, who has at times been tagged out of games, marrying that up with a degree of skepticism. So that's just from the next few weeks. But I also think that I would not be surprised to see Ross Lyon continue to tinker with lineups. And this kind of goes to my other point, which is a coach that's like on the precipice of leaving finals will make some pretty wild throws positionally or tactically in order to get things to work. Trent Rivers was Simon Goodwin's throw when they've started to look bad, and it doesn't seem to have done their midfield any harm. But Ross Lyon might be a coach that you see make some interesting tactical choices. Maybe Nixie tries to show something different and really tries to throw the magnets around. And so it's looking at that a bit of a ladder analysis. And this is something that I think I talked about the last time I was on. But now it might apply to, well, we've got to win a game in any way. Don't be overconfident in roles. So it's not necessarily like who the specific... There are a few specific players just this week that I'm thinking about, but it's more thinking about some of the teams and the positions they're in on the ladder, and then either amping up or amping down your confidence that roles are going to stick, or that they might become extremely aggressive in stopping roles in order to eke out just that one extra win they need to stay, at 8th for an extra week, or to stay, in touch of the 8 for another week.
Yeah, some brilliantly helpful stuff for us to be, again, able to look at fixtures, who's played who, what's coming up, where are players sitting in the ladder, what are the teams doing, put all those variables alongside your break-evens, your rankings, the ownership percentages. Correlate all these elements alongside it to help you make the most informed decision and trade decisions and captaincy calls that you can over these next couple of weeks. Hey, Jordox, it's been an absolute pleasure, mate, having you back on the podcast yet again. I think we're maybe up to 5 or 6 weeks in a row, which might just be a record for us having you back on the podcast, mate. As always, mate, a pleasure, mate. Thanks for jumping on for us.
Yeah, no worries, mate. Happy to jump on anytime.
And Liam, as always, now I think it's the second episode we've had you on in the coaches panel. Where can people get in touch with you? I know the AFL Fantasy Women's Competition is fast approaching. I'm expecting plenty of fine content from you in that space. But where can we keep in touch with you across social media, whether it be for your analysis about AFL Fantasy or the women's game that is fast approaching and starting for us?
Yeah, I'm expecting a launch of the fantasy game, inside of maybe in 3 weeks. So kind of the end of this month. And you can find me on Twitter at Liam AFLW Fantasy, and you can listen to my podcast, Free Kick, on all good platforms, and follow us on Twitter as well at Free Kick W Pod.
We've got all the links for both Jordox, for Liam, for the Free Kick Pod, and everything you've just heard the boys mention are in the description of this podcast episode. So if you want to keep in touch, find out, follow more, go and check out those links in the description. It's got all the details of what you need. Hey, good luck, friend, heading into this week and the trade decisions and the ponderings that you're making. If you're part of our Patreon, the good news is you get to reach out to the coaches panel members directly, get in touch with us, and get a bunch of additional rewards depending on the tier you're in. So if you're part of the Coaches Panel Patreon. It's just one of the great rewards you get. If you want to join that, all the details to find a tier that's right for you, just like you can get in touch with these boys, is in the description of this episode. If you're listening to this as an audio podcast, you haven't subscribed and give it a 5-star rating, we'd encourage you to do that. And if you're watching this on YouTube, hi, the hair is real, by the way, as is Liam's mustache, the finest stash in fantasy community. I'm going to make it stick, mate. I'm going to make it stick.
Oh, no. Okay.
It's only fair. If you want to and haven't already subscribed to the channel, make sure you do it and comment below. Let me know, what are the trades you are making this week in AFL Fantasy? I want to know. Good luck this week. I hope early captains' decisions are favorable for you and you don't get stuck on a Sunday dilemma captaincy call. I hope the trades you make work in your favor. Until next time, we wish you well. And from us here at the Coaches Panel, good luck this week in AFL Fantasy.